History books usually hide the embarrassing stuff. Not today. We are skipping the brilliant strategies to look at the armies that declared war on soup, the soldiers defeated by actual bees, and the invasions where everyone just got drunk and attacked themselves. These are 33 of the absolute dumbest, weirdest, and most disastrous military failures that prove leadership is often overrated. 1. The Kettle War. In 1784, the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II decided he wanted the Scheldt River opened for trade. He sent 3 ships to demand passage, expecting the Dutch to just roll over. The Dutch sent out a single warship, the Dolphin, to intercept them. You would expect a massive naval battle, right? Wrong. The Dolphin fired exactly 1 shot. It did not hit the hull. It did not hit the mast. It miraculously flew through the air and obliterated a soup kettle on the deck of the Austrian flagship. The soup went everywhere. Terrified by this devastating loss of lunch, the Austrian captain immediately surrendered his entire ship. This is not a joke. The only casualty of this entire military engagement was a pot of soup. The Austrians went home hungry, and history got the most ridiculous naval name ever. 2. The Battle of Tanga. During World War I, the British decided to invade German East Africa with 8,000 troops. They outnumbered the Germans 8-1, so this should have been a walk in the park. But as they marched through the mangroves near Tanga, they disturbed the one enemy they hadn't planned for: angry, feral bees. Thousands of them. The bees did not care about uniforms or alliances. They just started stinging everyone in sight. The British troops, who had machine guns and artillery, broke rank and ran screaming for their lives back to the beaches. It was absolute chaos. Some soldiers were stung hundreds of times. The British actually had to abandon their equipment and flee to their ships to escape the insects. The local press later called it the Battle of the Bees, proving that nature is the ultimate superweapon. 3. The Voyage of the Russian Baltic Fleet. This is widely considered the worst naval journey in human history. In 1904, Russia sent its Baltic Fleet all the way around the world to fight Japan. The incompetence began immediately. While still in the North Sea, near the United Kingdom, the Russians saw some shadows in the fog. Panic ensued. Thinking they were surrounded by Japanese torpedo boats, which were literally halfway around the planet, the Russians opened fire. They engaged in a furious battle with a fleet of British fishing trawlers. They sank a fishing boat, killed 2 fishermen, and even managed to shoot their own ship in the confusion. It gets better. To boost morale, the sailors bought exotic pets in Madagascar, including venomous snakes that escaped and terrorized the crew. By the time they finally reached Japan after 7 months of clown show disasters, they were promptly destroyed in hours. 4. The Pastry War. Usually, nations go to war for land, oil, or religion. In 1838, France invaded Mexico because of a bakery. A French pastry chef living in Mexico City, Monsieur Ramontel, claimed that Mexican officers looted his shop during some civil unrest. He demanded an absurd amount of money for his lost croissants and cakes. The Mexican government basically laughed in his face. So, the baker wrote to the King of France. King Louis-Philippe took this very seriously. He demanded 600,000 pesos from Mexico, and when they refused, he sent the entire French fleet to blockade the country and bombard the fortress of San Juan de Ulua. People died. Ships were sunk. A literal war was fought, all because a guy could not get over his stolen pastries. Mexico eventually paid the money, making those the most expensive cakes in history. 5. Operation Cottage. In 1943, American and Canadian forces prepared a massive invasion to retake the island of Kiska from the Japanese in the Pacific. They brought over 34,000 troops, battleships, and heavy air support. They stormed the beaches ready for a bloodbath. But there was a tiny problem. The Japanese had secretly evacuated the entire island 2 weeks earlier using submarines. The island was completely empty. But did that stop the chaos? No. In the thick, freezing fog, the Allied troops became disoriented and paranoid. They started hearing noises and firing at shadows. Tragically, American and Canadian units began shooting at each other in the confusion. By the time they realized the enemy wasn't there, over 300 Allied soldiers were dead or wounded from friendly fire and Japanese booby traps. They conquered an empty rock and still lost. 6. The Battle of Karansebis. This is the gold standard of military stupidity. In 1788, the Austrian army of 100,000 men was marching to fight the Ottoman Empire. One night, the vanguard of hussars crossed a river to scout, but found some locals selling schnapps instead of Turks. They got drunk. When the infantry caught up and asked for some alcohol, the drunk hussars refused and built a barricade. A fistfight broke out. Someone fired a shot. In the darkness and confusion, someone shouted that the Turks were attacking. Panic spread instantly. German-speaking officers shouted halt to restore order, but soldiers who spoke other languages thought they were shouting Allah. The army turned on itself, firing wildly into the dark masses. They fought a brutal battle against themselves all night. The next morning, 10,000 men were dead or wounded. The Ottomans arrived 2 days later, found the corpses, and easily took the city. 7. The Battle of Fishguard. This was the last invasion of mainland Britain, and it was a total farce. In 1797, 1,400 French soldiers landed in Wales. Well, I say soldiers, but many were just convicts forced into uniforms. As soon as they landed, they found a Portuguese ship that had wrecked nearby and was full of wine. The invasion force immediately got blackout drunk. They started looting local farmhouses, not for strategy, but for food. The local Welsh militia began to gather, but the real heroes were the local women. According to legend, hundreds of Welsh women came out to watch the show wearing traditional red shawls and tall black hats. Through the drunken beer goggles of the French, these women looked exactly like British redcoat infantry soldiers. Terrified by the sight of this massive elite army of grandmas, the French surrendered unconditionally. 8. Liechtenstein's army. This is technically an invasion, but it is the most wholesome military operation ever recorded. In 1866, during the Austro-Prussian War, Liechtenstein sent out its army of 80 men to guard a mountain pass in Italy. They were not really interested in fighting. In fact, they avoided all combat, spent their time admiring the beautiful scenery, drinking wine, and smoking pipes. When the war ended, they marched back home to Vaduz. But here is the kicker. They left with 80 men, but they returned with 81. Apparently, they had made a friend along the way. An Austrian liaison officer, or perhaps an Italian defector, nobody is quite sure, who decided to join them. So, Liechtenstein is the only country in history to send an army to war and return with negative casualties. They literally gained a guy. 9. The invasion of Dominica. In 1761, the British were trying to capture the Caribbean island of Dominica from the French. The French defenders were on high alert, waiting nervously in the dark for an enemy attack. One night, the French sentries heard strange noises coming from the jungle. It sounded like thousands of footsteps and hushed signals. Convinced that a massive British army was surrounding them, the French soldiers panicked. They spent the entire night firing their muskets blindly into the trees, shouting orders, and preparing for a glorious last stand. When the sun finally rose, they saw the carnage. There were no British soldiers. The French had spent all night waging a desperate war against thousands of local giant frogs, known as mountain chickens, whose croaking sounded exactly like footsteps. They had literally run out of ammo fighting amphibians. 10. The Anglo-Zanzibar War. If you have a short attention span, this is the war for you. In 1896, a new sultan took over Zanzibar without British permission. The British Empire politely asked him to step down. He refused and barricaded himself in the palace. At 9:02 in the morning, 5 British warships opened fire. What followed was not a battle. It was a demolition job. The palace was turned to rubble, the Sultan's artillery was silenced, and his royal yacht was sunk immediately. By 9:40, the Sultan's flag was cut down. The entire war lasted exactly 38 minutes. It is officially the shortest war in recorded history. You could watch a sitcom episode including commercials and it would still be longer than this entire military conflict. 11. United States invasion of Canada. In 1812, the United States decided to invade Canada, assuming it would be, in the words of Thomas Jefferson, a mere matter of marching. It was actually a mere matter of stumbling. The Americans planned a fancy three-pronged attack, but everything went wrong immediately. The militia refused to cross the border, arguing their constitution only required them to fight on American soil. Another general, William Hull, was so terrified of indigenous warriors that he surrendered Detroit without a single shot being fired, despite having a larger army than the British. Meanwhile, on the Niagara front, Americans tried to cross a river but forgot to bring enough oars for their boats, making them sitting ducks. Instead of liberating Canada, the U.S. troops basically just annoyed their neighbors and burned down a few buildings before getting kicked out. 12. The Whiskey War. This is the most polite and alcoholic conflict in human history. For decades, Canada and Denmark disputed the ownership of Hans Island, a tiny frozen rock in the Arctic with absolutely no resources. But instead of sending tanks, they sent booze. Every few months, the Canadian military would land, plant a maple leaf flag, and leave a bottle of Canadian Club whiskey for the Danes. Then, the Danish military would arrive, remove the Canadian flag, plant their own, and leave a bottle of schnapps for the Canadians. This passive-aggressive exchange went on from 1973 until 2022. No one died, no shots were fired, but thousands of brain cells were sacrificed to the horrors of a hangover. It was the only war where the soldiers were probably hoping the enemy would invade more often. 13. Napoleon's invasion of Russia. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 men, to teach Russia a lesson. He marched on Moscow, expecting a quick victory. But the Russians had a different strategy. They just kept running away. They burned their own villages and crops so the French could not eat, a tactic known as scorched earth. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, he found it empty and on fire. He waited for a surrender that never came. Then the real enemy arrived, General Winter. The French, dressed in summer uniforms, were forced to retreat in freezing temperatures. Starving, freezing, and harassed by Cossacks, the Grand Army melted away. It was a military disaster of biblical proportions, proving that you should never start a land war in Russia unless you pack a very warm coat. 14. The Toledo War. In 1835, the U.S. states of Ohio and Michigan nearly started a civil war over a thin strip of swampy land called the Toledo Strip. Both states mobilized their militias. The governor of Michigan, the boy governor Stevens Mason, was ready for blood. The armies marched into the swamp and immediately got lost. They spent weeks wandering around, yelling at each other, and getting eaten by mosquitoes. The only violence occurred when a Michigan deputy sheriff stabbed an Ohio man named Two Stickney in the leg with a penknife. That was the casualty list. Eventually, the U.S. president intervened. Ohio got the strip of land, and Michigan was given the Upper Peninsula as a consolation prize. Ironically, the Upper Peninsula turned out to be full of valuable copper and iron, so Michigan accidentally won the war by losing it. 15. The Battle of Adwa. In the late 19th century, European powers were scrambling to colonize Africa. Italy decided they wanted Ethiopia. They assumed that because they were a modern European nation, they would easily crush the local African forces. They were wrong. The Italian commanders used outdated maps that did not match the terrain, causing their army to split up and get confused in the mountains. Worse, they underestimated Emperor Menelik II, who had modernized his army with Russian and French weapons. When the battle started in 1896, the Italians were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. It was a total wipeout. The Ethiopians crushed the Italian army, securing their independence and shocking the entire world. It remains one of the greatest underdog victories in history, proving that arrogance is a terrible military strategy. 16. The Fourth Crusade. This was supposed to be a holy mission to recapture Jerusalem from Islamic rule. It ended up being a bunch of broke knights looting a Christian city. In 1204, the Crusaders arrived in Venice to rent ships. but they did not have enough money. The blind Doge of Venice made them a deal: capture a rival city for him, and he would let them sail. One bad decision led to another, and eventually they found themselves outside Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire and the center of Eastern Christianity. Instead of fighting the actual enemy, they got greedy and sacked Constantinople. They burned libraries, stole relics, and destroyed the city they were religiously aligned with. They never even made it to Jerusalem. It was the ultimate friendly fire incident, permanently weakening the Byzantine Empire for no reason other than greed. 17. The Jameson Raid. In 1895, a British colonial administrator named Leander Starr Jameson decided to play hero. He led a private army into the Transvaal Republic in South Africa, believing that his arrival would trigger a massive uprising of British expatriate gold miners against the local Boer government. It was a classic case of main character syndrome. Jameson marched in with confidence, but there was one small problem. Nobody had told the miners to rebel. When Jameson arrived, instead of an army of angry revolutionaries, he found people just drinking beer and confused about why he was there. The Boers quickly surrounded Jameson's force, and he surrendered in humiliation. The raid was so disastrous that it embarrassed the British government globally and arguably helped start the Second Boer War, all because one guy did not check if his friends were actually ready to fight. 18. Paraguayan War. This is a lesson in why you should check a map before declaring war. In 1864, the Paraguayan dictator Francisco Solano López decided to turn his landlocked country into a military superpower. He declared war on Brazil. That was a bad idea. Then, he decided to declare war on Argentina. That was a worse idea. Finally, Uruguay joined in, forming the Triple Alliance. López was fighting three neighbors at once, and his country was completely surrounded. It was military suicide. The war lasted 5 years and was absolutely devastating. Paraguay lost roughly 90% of its adult male population. They fought until they were drafting children with fake beards to look like soldiers. López's delusions of grandeur turned a prosperous nation into a graveyard, proving that taking on the entire neighborhood alone is never a winning strategy. 19. Battle of Sarıkamış. In 1914, the Ottoman Minister of War, Enver Pasha, decided he wanted to be the next Napoleon. He planned a massive offensive against Russia in the Caucasus Mountains. But there was a slight issue. It was December, in the mountains, and his soldiers were wearing summer uniforms and flimsy sandals. German advisors told him it was suicide, but Enver ignored them, dreaming of glory. As the army marched up the mountain passes, temperatures dropped to -30 degrees. It was a catastrophe. Tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers froze to death without ever firing a single shot at the Russians. They were turned into ice statues by their own commander's ego. Out of 90,000 men, only a fraction returned. Enver Pasha then returned to Istanbul and tried to censor the news so nobody would know he had just frozen his own army to death. 20. Attack on the Medway. In 1667, England was at war with the Netherlands, but King Charles II was running out of money. He decided to save cash by docking his biggest warships in the River Medway and leaving them largely unprotected. He basically put the Royal Navy in storage. The Dutch Admiral Michiel de Ruyter heard about this and could not believe his luck. The Dutch fleet sailed right up the river, smashed through a defensive chain, and burned the English fleet while it sat helpless in the water. To top it off, they towed away the English flagship, the Royal Charles, as a trophy. It was the worst humiliation in the history of the Royal Navy. The English sailors were literally watching from the shore as the Dutch sailed away with their best boat, presumably laughing all the way back to Amsterdam. 21. The Fenian Raids. Between 1866 and 1871, a group of Irish Americans known as the Fenian Brotherhood came up with a truly bizarre plan. They wanted to free Ireland from British rule. Since Ireland was too far away, they decided to attack the nearest piece of the British Empire they could find, Canada. Their logic was that if they conquered Canada, they could hold it hostage and trade it for Ireland's independence. It sounds like a drunk bar bet, but they actually tried it. Thousands of Fenians crossed the border from the United States into Canada multiple times. They won a few skirmishes but were eventually pushed back by Canadian militia and British regulars. The United States government, embarrassed by its own citizens invading a neighbor, eventually intervened and arrested the Fenian leaders. They failed to free Ireland, but they did succeed in annoying Canada significantly. 22. Mongol invasions of Japan. The Mongols conquered more land than anyone in history, but they had one weakness: the weather. In 1274, Kublai Khan sent a massive fleet to conquer Japan. The samurai were fighting bravely, but the Mongols had better technology and numbers. Japan was on the verge of defeat. Then, a massive typhoon swept in and destroyed the Mongol fleet. 7 years later, in 1281, the Mongols returned with an even bigger fleet, one of the largest in history. And guess what? Another massive typhoon hit at the exact same moment, wiping them out again. The Japanese called these storms kamikaze, or divine wind, believing the gods were protecting them. The Mongols, the most terrifying land army on Earth, were defeated twice by bad weather forecasts. It remains the biggest case of cosmic bad luck in military history. 23. The Bay of Pigs. In 1961, the CIA hatched a plan to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba. They trained a force of Cuban exiles and planned an amphibious invasion at the Bay of Pigs. The plan relied on the idea that the Cuban people would rise up and join the invaders. They did not. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The invasion site was a swamp, which bogged down the troops. The promised U.S. air support was confused by a time zone error. The pilots and the ground troops were operating on different clocks, so the bombers arrived late. Castro's forces were waiting and crushed the invasion in 3 days. It was a total public humiliation for President John F. Kennedy. Instead of a secret coup, it became a global broadcast of incompetence, cementing Castro's power for decades. 24. Invasion of the Scilly Isles. This is known as the 335 Years' War, and it is the weirdest conflict on the books. In 1651, during the English Civil War, the Dutch declared war on the Royalists who were hiding out on the tiny Scilly Isles off the coast of Cornwall. Shortly after, the Royalists surrendered to the English parliamentarians. The Dutch Navy went home, but everyone forgot one small detail. They never signed a peace treaty with the Scilly Isles specifically. Legally, the islands remained at war with the Netherlands for centuries. There were no battles, no shots fired, just a clerical error hanging over history. Finally, in 1986, a historian noticed the mistake. The Dutch ambassador flew to the islands and a peace treaty was officially signed, ending the longest and most bloodless war in history. 25. Battle of Hattin. In 1187, the Crusader King Guy of Lusignan made a decision that military historians still facepalm over today. He decided to march his army across a scorching dry plateau in the middle of July to fight Saladin. He ignored all advice to stay near water sources. Saladin, being a genius, simply waited. He blocked the wells and even set fire to the dry grass to smoke the Crusaders out. The Christian knights were marching in heavy metal armor under the blazing desert sun. It was like wearing an oven. By the time the battle actually started, the Crusaders were not fighting for land or religion. They were fighting for a cup of water. Exhausted, dehydrated, and delirious, they were easily slaughtered or captured. The entire kingdom of Jerusalem was lost because the king forgot to pack drinks for the road trip. 26. The Spanish Armada. In 1588, King Philip II of Spain launched the Invincible Armada to conquer England. It was the largest fleet ever assembled, but the execution was a comedy of errors. The commander, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, had virtually no naval experience and actually wrote to the king trying to quit because he got terrible seasickness. When they arrived, the English sent burning ships into their formation, causing a massive panic. The Spanish ships cut their anchors and fled north. But the real enemy was the weather. A massive storm swept them around Scotland and Ireland, smashing their ships against the rocks. Thousands of sailors washed ashore. The so-called Invincible Armada lost half its ships without